She was 18 years old and newly orphaned, and when the solicitor read out the division of the old house at Bramble End, her two elder sisters took the rooms, the furniture, the linen, and the plate, and left Laura Turner only a battered trunk in the shuttered attic beneath the slates. She did not argue. She climbed the ladder in her morning dress and turned the key. What lay folded inside that trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with faded tape, would in time make her richer than either sister ever guessed. Settle in with us, and if you're joining tonight from a lamplit kitchen or a quiet room somewhere in the world, do tell us where you're watching from, and press the little bell so you don't miss what comes after. Laura Turner had been born in the last week of a wet March in the year 1848, in the low stone house at the end of the lane at Bramble End, in the parish of St. Michael, on the Warwickshire side of the border, where the hedges thickened and the lanes grew narrow enough that two carts could not pass. Her father, Mr. Edmund Turner, had been a corn factor of middling business and steady habits, a widower twice over by the time Laura was 9, and a man who kept his ledgers in a neat sloping hand and his affections in equally neat compartments. Her mother had died of a low fever in the summer of Laura's 4th year, and after that the house had been kept by her father's unmarried cousin, Miss Honora Wren, who came down from a farm above Bidford with a black straw bonnet, a pair of steel spectacles, and a wooden work-box that she set upon the kitchen dresser and never afterwards moved. Miss Wren was 52 when she took charge of the household, and she was the making of Laura in every particular that mattered. She taught her to hem a sheet before she was 6, to turn a collar before she was 8, to keep a bread account and a butter account in a ruled book, and to know good muslin from bad by drawing it between finger and thumb. She taught her to press flowers between the leaves of the family Bible, to render lard, to make a poultice of linseed and mustard for a bad cough, and to write out a receipt in a clear round hand so that any tradesman could read it at a glance. She was not affectionate in the ordinary sense. She did not kiss the child at bedtime, and she did not call her by pet names. But she sat beside her at the kitchen table for 10 winters together. And when Laura was ill, she carried up broth in a blue-rimmed bowl, and when Laura brought her first stitched sampler down to be praised, she looked at it a long moment and said quietly that the work was good, and that good work would carry a girl further than a pretty face ever had. Laura remembered that sentence for the rest of her life. The two elder sisters, Margaret and Adelaide, had been 11 and 9 when their own mother died, and they had never taken to Miss Wren. Margaret, the eldest by 7 years, had grown into a tall, handsome woman with a taste for lace collars and a quick, cutting way of speaking. Adelaide, quieter and softer, followed Margaret in most things and disliked disagreement. Both had married young, Margaret to a corn dealer's son from Alcester, Adelaide to an ironmonger at Redditch, and both had come home to Bramble End only for Christmas dinners and funerals, and had spoken to Miss Wren, when they spoke to her at all, as though she were a servant of long standing whose place must be tolerated but never mistaken. When Miss Wren died, in the January of 1865, of a slow congestion of the lungs that she bore without complaint, she left Laura 3 things: a small silver thimble that had belonged to her own mother, worn thin at the rim from 40 years of use, a copy of Mrs. Rundle's Domestic Cookery bound in shabby green cloth, and tucked inside the front cover of that book, a folded square of paper on which she had written, in the same clear hand she had taught the girl, only the words, "For Laura, who will do very well. Keep your head. H.W." The thimble Laura wore afterwards on a length of black silk cord about her neck, under her dress where no one saw it, and she was wearing it still on the afternoon when her father, 3 years later, died of a stroke in his own armchair with an open ledger upon his knee, and the solicitor from Evesham was sent for, and the lane at Bramble End filled with the black gowns and low voices of a household preparing to be divided. The solicitor was a Mr. Halliwell, a thin grey man of about 60, who wore a black frock coat gone shiny at the elbows and carried his papers in a leather case tied with a bootlace. He came out from Evesham on the Tuesday after the funeral, sat down at the parlour table with the three sisters, laid the will flat under his hand, and read it through in a voice that had read a great many such wills, and expected to read a great many more. Mr. Edmund Turner had made his will 6 years earlier, in the summer after Miss Wren's death, and had directed only that his effects, his goods, and the house at Bramble End be divided between his 3 daughters in such shares and portions as they shall between them agree, my 2 elder daughters being married and settled, and my youngest being yet a minor and in the care of the household. He had trusted his daughters to divide fairly. He had written no schedule. He had named no executor beyond Mr. Halliwell himself, whose duty was only to witness the agreement and to enter it into the deed. Margaret had come prepared. She had brought a sheet of paper already ruled into 3 columns, and she had written the columns out the night before in the room above the ironmonger's at Redditch, where she had sat with Adelaide over a small fire and a pot of weak tea, and had told her sister what was reasonable and what was not. In Margaret's column stood the front parlour, the best bedroom, the dining room with its mahogany table and 8 chairs, the linen press, the plate, the tea service, the pier glass, and the 8-day clock in the hall. In Adelaide's column stood the back parlour, the second bedroom, the kitchen dresser with its blue plates, the copper pans, the settle, the pair of Windsor chairs, and the ledgers of Mr. Edmund Turner, which the ironmonger at Redditch thought might be worth something for the accounts they carried. In Laura's column, in Margaret's neat sloping hand, stood 1 line only, the trunk in the attic. Margaret set the paper before Mr. Halliwell, and she spoke evenly, as a woman speaks who has thought a matter through. Laura was a minor still, she said, and unmarried, and had no house of her own to furnish, and could not have use for a dining table or a linen press, and would in any case be going to live with one of her sisters, as was proper. The trunk in the attic, Margaret said, held their mother's things and some old papers of no value, and it was fitting that the youngest should have it as a keepsake. Adelaide, seated with her hands folded, did not speak, and did not look at Laura, and only nodded once when Margaret's finger came to rest on the last line. Mr. Halliwell looked at Laura over the top of his spectacles. He asked her, in the careful way of a man who has been asked to witness worse divisions and has learned to make sure, whether she agreed to the terms as they were set down. Laura sat quite still with her hands in her lap, and the black silk cord warm against her collarbone. She thought of Miss Wren's paper. "Keep your head," she said, in a voice that was steady and low, that she agreed. Mr. Halliwell wrote the terms into the deed in his slow, careful hand, and each of the 3 sisters signed, and Mr. Halliwell blotted the signatures with a square of pink blotting paper, and folded the deed and put it into his leather case and tied the bootlace and stood up. He said only, at the door, that Laura might send to him at Evesham if she had need. He did not say of what. Then he went out to his gig, and Margaret and Adelaide went upstairs together to begin the sorting of the linen, and Laura went up alone under the slates. She took what was hers. She took the trunk down the ladder that evening, with the help of the garden boy, who was 15 and had a good back, and she paid him a penny out of the 7 3/4 she had in her purse. She took Miss Wren's copy of Mrs. Rundle's Domestic Cookery in its shabby green cloth. She took the folded square of paper from inside its front cover and pinned it, for that one night, inside the pocket of her dress. She took the silver thimble on its black silk cord, which she had never taken off. She took one change of linen, one plain gray stuff gown for weekdays, her morning dress, a shawl, a bonnet, and a pair of stout ankle boots that had been resoled in the autumn. She took nothing else out of the rooms her sisters had claimed. When Margaret asked, at supper, whether she meant to come to Alcester or to Redditch, Laura said she meant to go to the cottage at the top of the lane, which had belonged to Miss Wren's sister and stood empty since the summer, and to which Laura had a right of use for a year by an old promise never written down but known in the village. Margaret said that was as she pleased. Adelaide said nothing. The trunk stayed that night in the scullery, where Laura had asked the boy to set it down. In the morning, before the household was fully astir, Laura Turner put on her morning dress and her bonnet and her stout ankle boots, wrapped her shawl close about her shoulders, took up the small carpet bag into which she had packed her linen and her book and her paper of receipts, and asked the carter, Mr. Bunce, who came down the lane every Wednesday with sacks of flour for the mill, whether he would carry a trunk half a mile up the hill for sixpence. Mr. Bunce, who had known her father for 30 years, said he would carry it for nothing, and that a Turner ought not to be paying carting money to a Bunce. And he heaved the battered trunk into the back of his cart between 2 sacks of flour and covered it with a piece of sacking against the wet. The morning was gray and low, with a soft, steady rain such as comes in the middle of March in that country, and the lane was heavy with mud and the hedges dripping. Laura walked beside the cart, because the seat was narrow, and Mr. Bunce's dog, a lean, brindle bitch called Nell, had the place beside him. She walked in her stout boots with her skirt held out of the worst of the mud, and she watched the hedges pass, and the bare thorn, and the last of the winter's old man's beard gray on the blackthorn, and a rook lifting out of a ploughed field with a slow, heavy wing beat. And she felt the cold rain on her cheek and the warmth of the thimble against her collarbone under her dress. Bramble End, at that hour, was quiet. The smoke from the low chimneys leaned sideways in the wet air and did not rise. The church of St. Michael stood dark under its wet slates on the far side of the green, and the 4 elms about the green were still bare and black. Laura did not look back at the low stone house at the end of the lane where she had been born, and where her mother had died, and her father had died, and Miss Wren had died, and where her sisters were at that moment folding sheets into the linen press that had been counted into Margaret's column. She looked ahead, up the hill. The cottage at the top of the lane was 3/4 of a mile from the house at Bramble End, up a rise past the pound and the smithy and a stand of hazel that had not been coppiced for 6 or 7 years. It was a walk of 20 minutes in fine weather. In the wet of that March morning, with the trunk creaking in the cart and Mr. Bunce whistling a low, tuneless whistle between his teeth and Nell trotting steady in the rut of the wheel, it took them nearer 40. Laura's boots grew heavy with mud. Her hem darkened to the knee. Her hands inside her mittens grew cold, and then numb, and then warm again with walking. She counted the milestones of the little journey by the small landmarks of a country she had known all her life. The gate to Weaver's Field, where she had gathered mushrooms as a child of 7. The low sagging wall where old Mr. Perry had sat in the summer with his pipe. The ash tree where a barn owl had nested every year in her memory, and she supposed, in the memory of her mother before her. She was leaving nothing. She was walking with all she owned in a carpet bag and a battered trunk and a silver thimble at her throat, 3/4 of a mile up her own parish lane. And yet, by the time she reached the crooked green door of the cottage at the top, and saw the slates dark with wet and the small square window sunk under its eaves and the thorn grown up over the low front wall, she understood that she had come, in that short walk, further from the house where she had been born than either of her sisters would ever come from it. The key still worked in the crooked green door, though the lock had rusted and the wood swelled with the wet of a winter, and Laura had to set her shoulder against the panels and lean before the door swung inward with a low complaint. The cottage inside was cold as a well. It smelled of old damp plaster and last summer's wood smoke and mice. It was 3 rooms and an attic under the slates, and the whole of it was smaller than the parlor Margaret had entered into her column at the deal table the day before. There was a flagged kitchen with a black range set into a fireplace of local red brick, a small parlor with a single window looking over the lane and a fireplace of the same brick, and behind them a slip of a scullery with a stone sink and a pump that would need priming. A narrow boxed staircase went up between the kitchen and the parlor to a single low chamber under the eaves where Miss Wren's sister, Miss Frances Marlowe, had slept for the last 11 years of her widowhood, and had died in the previous August in a rush-seated chair by the window without troubling anyone. The bed was still there under a gray ticking cover. The chair was still there. A tin candlestick with a stub of tallow in it stood on the sill. Mr. Bunce brought the trunk in on his shoulder with the ease of a man who had carried heavier for less, set it down in the middle of the kitchen floor upon the flags, touched the brim of his hat, and refused a penny. He said he would look in on Wednesday next when he came down with the flour, and if she wanted anything from the village, she was to leave a slate on the sill and he would fetch it. Nell put her nose against Laura's cold hand and went out again after him. The cart creaked away down the hill, and the sound of the wheel and the whistle grew small, and then were gone under the noise of the rain on the slates. Laura stood for a moment in the quiet. The cottage was hers to use for 1 year by an old promise that had never been written down, and everything within its walls was Miss Frances Marlowe's. The range with its cracked fire brick, the deal table scrubbed to the color of oatmeal, the 2 rush chairs, the row of blue-rimmed plates on the dresser that were the near cousins of the ones now counted into Adelaide's column at the foot of the hill, the small brass fender, the black kettle, the flat iron, the pair of good pewter spoons in the drawer, and the little tin box of tea, still with a spoonful of black leaves in the bottom, that stood upon the shelf. Nothing in the cottage was new, and nothing in it was mended past use. The slates on the low roof were sound, but for one which let a slow drip into a saucer on the attic floor, and the plaster was flaked in a patch above the parlor hearth, where a chimney had smoked in a bad wind, and the little square window in the eaves was cracked across one pane and mended with a strip of tarred paper. But the walls were dry to a hand's height above the flags, and the range drew when Laura laid a fire of the kindling that had been left in the basket, and the pump, primed with half a jug of rainwater from a butt at the door, gave up a stream of clear cold water after 4 dry strokes. Laura hung her wet shawl on the back of a rush chair. She set the small carpet bag upon the deal table. She lit the fire and put the kettle on to boil. Then she knelt on the flags beside the battered trunk, took the key from the pocket of her dress, and turned it in the lock for the 2nd time in as many days. Under the raised lid, in the light of the low gray window and the growing red of the range, Laura began to lift out what her sisters had called their mother's things and some old papers of no value. On the top lay a folded shawl of gray wool such as a country woman might have worn to church for 20 years, and beneath it a christening gown of fine long cloth yellowed at the seams, and beneath that a child's sampler worked in cross-stitch with the alphabet, the numerals, a house, a tree, and the name Frances Marlowe, aged 9, 1798. Laura set each thing upon the scrubbed table with the same care she would have used at Miss Wren's elbow. Below the sampler was a layer of brown paper, and below the brown paper a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied about with the same faded tape that had bound the whole. Laura cut the tape with a pair of small scissors from her carpet bag. She turned back the oilcloth on the flags. Inside were papers. There were a great many of them, tied in 3 separate packets with red legal ribbon, and each packet had a label written in a firm, upright hand in ink now brown with age. The first packet was labeled Certificates, 3% Consolidated Annuities, in the name of Frances Marlowe, spinster, of Bramble End. The second was labeled Deeds, Cottage and Orchard at Bramble End, freehold, bought of Squire Ellingham, 1822. The third was labeled London and Midland Bank, Deposit Receipts, in the name of Frances Marlowe. Under the 3 packets lay a small leather bag tied at the neck with a bootlace, heavy in the hand, that gave, when Laura loosened it upon her palm, the dulled gleam of 40 sovereigns in gold. And beneath the bag lay a folded letter, sealed once with red wax and broken and folded again, addressed on the outside in the same upright hand, for whichever of my kin shall have need of this, and shall have wit to find it. Laura sat back upon her heels on the flags. The kettle behind her began to sing. She did not rise to it. She broke the fold of the letter and read it by the gray window, in the light of that wet March morning, in the empty cottage at the top of her own parish lane. To whoever finds this, my name is Frances Marlowe. I am a spinster of the parish of St. Michael at Bramble End. I was born in 1789 in the low stone house at the end of the lane, which was then my father's, and I lived there as a girl and a woman until my 28th year. My elder brother inherited the house at our father's death in 1817, and his son after him, and I was given no share of it, being a daughter and unmarried, and was sent to keep house for my sister in the cottage at the top of the lane. I do not complain of this, for it was the way of things. In 1822, my mother's brother, who had made his money in the Indies and had no children living, left me the sum of £800, which I told to no one, and with which I bought this cottage and its orchard from Squire Ellingham, and put the greater part into the 3% at the Bank of England, and a smaller sum on deposit in London. I have lived quietly here since, keeping my sister when she was ill and teaching such girls as would learn. I have added to the fund each year of my life. I am now 69, and my eyes are failing, and I do not expect to see another winter through. I have made no will, for the law would give the whole to my brother's grandchildren, who have never come up the hill to see me, and who do not need it, and I would rather leave it hidden and let it find the one of my blood who has the wit and the want to find it. I put it in this trunk, which was my mother's, and which will go when I am gone, to whichever child of that house has been given least. That child, I think, will look inside. My prayer is that she will use it well and quietly, and not tell her sisters, Frances Marlowe, spinster of Bramble End, this 30th day of September, 1858. Laura read the letter twice through, and then a third time, and the kettle behind her sang its thin note, and the rain on the slates went on with the small, steady sound of a country rain that means to fall for a day. She folded the letter along its old creases and laid it upon the table beside the christening gown and the child's sampler, and the 3 packets of papers tied with red ribbon, and the little leather bag heavy with gold. She put her hand up to her throat and felt, through the wet stuff of her morning dress, the small silver thimble on its black silk cord, warm from her skin, and she thought of Miss Wren's careful hand upon the folded square of paper, "Keep your head," and of Miss Frances Marlowe, who had been given least in her own father's house, and had bought this cottage over their heads and told no one, and had left, for a girl she would never see, 40 sovereigns, a bundle of certificates, and a letter that ended with a prayer. Laura did as the letter asked. She said nothing to Margaret and nothing to Adelaide, and when at last she rose from the flagged floor, she put the 3 packets back into the oilcloth, folded the cloth over them, laid the leather bag of gold at the center, and set the whole bundle down inside the trunk again beneath the gray wool shawl and the christening gown and the child's sampler, and turned the key. She kept 2 sovereigns out and slipped them into a small linen bag she pinned into the pocket of her under petticoat next to the folded square of paper from Miss Wren. The first work she set herself to was the cottage. She began where any woman taught by Miss Wren would have begun, which was with the range and the flags and the walls, and she began upon that same wet March afternoon with the kettle still on. She scrubbed the flagged kitchen with hot water and washing soda and a piece of rough sacking, working from the far corner toward the door, and when the flags were dry, she rubbed them over with a little linseed oil to keep the damp from rising. She swept the chimney with a bundle of holly tied to a broom handle passed up through the flue, and drew down a heap of soot into a sheet spread on the hearth. She took the fender out into the yard and cleaned it with brick dust and a leather. She washed the blue-rimmed plates on the dresser one at a time in a basin of hot water. She turned the ticking cover of the bed upstairs, beat it against the low front wall until the dust rose off it in a gray cloud, and hung it in the wind that came down from the hill. On the Wednesday, as he had said, Mr. Bunce looked in on his way down with the flour, and Laura had a slate on the sill with 3 items written upon it: a pound of candles, half a pound of tea, and a paper of nails. He took the slate with him and returned in the evening with the things wrapped in brown paper and a small twist of tobacco he laid on the table for himself, and said he would smoke on the step if she did not mind it, which she did not. He looked at the roof from the yard, stepped into the parlor, put his hand up to the flaked plaster above the hearth, and said the chimney wanted repointing and the one slate wanted replacing before another wet month, and that he would send his sister's boy, Tom Ashby, who was 17 and worked with Mr. Redfern the mason at Bidford. Tom Ashby came on the Friday with a canvas bag of tools upon his shoulder. He climbed the roof in his stockinged feet, drew out the broken slate with a slate ripper, set a new one in its bed of lime mortar, and pointed the ridge along 4 feet of the coping where the mortar had crumbled to gray powder. He came down and would take only a shilling for the day and a plate of bread and dripping at the deal table. He said Mr. Redfern would come himself on the Saturday and see to the parlor chimney, and Mr. Redfern did. Mr. Redfern was 54, thin, hard-handed, a mason of 30 years' standing, and he brought a bucket of lime and a hair of horsehair for the plaster. He raked out the loose mortar in the parlor flue, repointed it in fresh lime, replastered the wall above the hearth in 2 coats, and set a small iron plate over the crack in the fire brick of the range. He charged Laura 6 shillings for the work and the materials, and Laura paid him in silver from her purse, and did not touch the linen bag pinned into her petticoat. On the Monday of the following week, Laura walked down the hill in her morning dress and stout ankle boots to the smithy, past the pound, past the stand of hazel, and along the green to the low white house next the church where Mr. Halliwell had told her she might send if she had need. She did not send. She wrote out a letter at the deal table the night before, in a clear round hand upon a sheet of paper, bought from the shop at Bidford, in which she set out that she had come into certain certificates and deeds and deposit receipts by the will and design of the late Miss Frances Marlowe, spinster, of the parish of St. Michael at Bramble End, and asked whether Mr. Halliwell would be so good as to advise her upon the proving of the same. And she signed the letter Laura Turner, and folded it, and gave it into Mr. Bunce's hand on the Wednesday to take with him into Evesham. Mr. Halliwell drove up in his gig on the Saturday after. He tied his horse to the ring in the low front wall, came in, sat at the deal table in his shiny black frock coat, drank a cup of tea from a blue-rimmed cup, and read every paper Laura laid before him. He read the certificates of the 3% consolidated annuities. He read the deeds of the cottage and orchard bought of Squire Ellingham in 1822. He read the deposit receipts of the London and Midland Bank. He read the letter of Miss Frances Marlowe last. He looked up over his steel spectacles at Laura and said quietly that the securities and the deposit stood plain in Miss Marlowe's name, and that Laura, as her nearest surviving kin in the female line, and as the child named in the letter by clear intent, could establish her claim without much difficulty, and that the cottage and orchard, being freehold and held by deed, were already in law hers to receive by the same course. He said he would draw the papers, that it would take a little time, and that his fee for the whole would be 2 guineas. He wrote down the sums as they stood in her name when the proving was done, and he wrote them slowly and read them aloud. £840 in the 3%, yielding £25, 4 shillings a year at 3%. £160 in the London and Midland Bank on deposit at 3.5%. The freehold of the cottage and its orchard of half an acre, and kept in her own hand 40 sovereigns in gold. He blotted the paper with pink blotting paper, folded it, and gave it to her across the table. He did not ask, and Laura did not tell him whether her sisters knew. He drank the last of his tea, tied his bootlace round his leather case, touched his hat, and went out to his gig. Laura pruned the orchard at the back of the cottage in the last week of March, when the rain broke off for 4 dry days. There were 9 trees, 6 apple, 2 pear, 1 damson, that had not been touched in 3 years, and she went at them with a pruning saw borrowed from Mr. Redfern and a pair of long-handled loppers lent by Mrs. Ashby at the smithy. She cut out the dead wood first and burned it in a heap at the bottom of the orchard, and then she cut back the water shoots and shortened the leaders and opened the crowns to the light in the way Miss Wren had shown her once at the farm above Bidford when Laura was 12. She dug over the bed by the scullery door and set in onions and early peas and a row of broad beans from a paper packet she bought from Mr. Halstead, the seedsman at Bidford, for 4pence. She whitewashed the scullery walls with a pail of lime and a broad brush, and she whitewashed the underside of the eaves in the attic where the slates had been mended, and the little cottage inside grew each week a little brighter and drier and more her own. By the middle of April, Bramble End knew that Miss Turner was up at the top of the lane in the cottage that had been Miss Marlowe's, and Bramble End knew her by name. Mrs. Ashby at the smithy, who was 40 and a widow of 2 winters, sent her boy up on a Saturday with a hot loaf wrapped in a cloth and a pat of butter on a leaf of cabbage. Old Mrs. Perry, who was 73 and lived in the 2-room cottage below the pound and had known Laura's mother, walked up the hill on the following Sunday, leaning on a blackthorn stick, sat in the rush chair by the parlor window, drank a cup of tea, and told Laura that her mother had been the kindest of the 3 women that house had held, and that Laura had her mother's mouth. Mr. Bunce came on his Wednesdays with whatever Laura had written on the slate, and on the 3rd Wednesday he brought Nell in and said the dog would sooner sit at Laura's fire than his own, and Laura let Nell lie on the flags and gave her a scrap of bacon rind. The vicar, the Reverend Mr. Padmore, who was 51 and had christened Laura in the font at St. Michael's, walked up the hill on a Tuesday afternoon in the last week of April with his hat in his hand. He sat at the deal table, ate a slice of Laura's seed cake, and asked whether she would think of taking 2 or 3 little girls of the village in the afternoons for reading and plain sewing and the keeping of a small account book, because Miss Marlowe had done so for many years, and there was no one now to do it, and the mothers had spoken to him. Laura said she would take 4 of them if he thought 4 not too many, at 3pence a week each, 3 afternoons in the week, from 2 o'clock till 4, in the parlor. And Mr. Padmore said 4 was very well, and that he would tell the mothers on the Sunday after church. By the first week of May, there were 4 little girls at the deal table 3 afternoons in the week. Emily Ashby, who was 9 and was Tom Ashby's youngest sister. Jane Perry, who was 8 and was old Mrs. Perry's granddaughter. Mary Halstead, who was 10 and was the seedsman's daughter. And little Susan Bunce, who was 7 and was Mr. Bunce's youngest. They came in clean pinafores with slates and pencils and a piece of coarse calico each, and Laura sat them along the deal table and taught them their letters and their numbers, and how to hem a plain seam, and how to set down the price of a loaf and a pound of tea and a paper of pins in a ruled column, and add them up. She kept the 4 pennies 3 pence in a small tin box on the mantel shelf, and at the end of each week she wrote the sum in a ruled book she had bought at Bidford for a shilling, in the neat, sloping hand she had learned from her father, and the clear, round hand she had learned from Miss Wren. She was known in Bramble End thereafter as Miss Turner up at the cottage, and it was Miss Turner they meant, not Margaret nor Adelaide, though Margaret and Adelaide were older and married, and had between them the front parlor and the back parlor, and the mahogany table, and the 8-day clock in the hall of the low stone house at the end of the lane. On the second Sunday of May, Laura walked down the hill in a plain gray stuff gown, a clean white collar, and her bonnet, and sat in the pew at St. Michael's that had been Miss Frances Marlowe's, 3rd from the back on the north side, and no one moved her. Mr. Padmore read the lesson. Old Mrs. Perry nodded to her from the pew in front. Mrs. Ashby, in her widow's black, sat 1 pew behind. Margaret and Adelaide were not there. They had gone that Sunday to Redditch. Laura sang the hymns in a low, steady voice, and thought of Miss Wren, who had never missed a Sunday when she had strength to walk, and of Miss Frances Marlowe, who had sat in that same pew for the last 11 years of her widowhood, and had said nothing to anyone of the £800 she had put quietly into the 3 per cents at the Bank of England. The little rituals of the cottage set themselves in the weeks that followed, with the quiet inevitability of habit. On Monday mornings, Laura washed in the scullery with a copper of hot water and a bar of yellow soap, and hung her linen on a rope stretched between 2 posts in the orchard. On Tuesdays, she baked bread in the oven of the Black Range, 4 small loaves at a time, and kept 1 for the week, and gave 1 to Mrs. Perry on her way down for the Wednesday market, and kept 2 for the girls and Mr. Bunce, and any who came. On Wednesday afternoons, Mr. Bunce came up with her slate and her twist of tea and her paper of nails, and sat on the step and smoked. On Thursday afternoons and Friday afternoons and Saturday afternoons, the 4 little girls came for their letters and their seams. On Sundays, she went down the hill to St. Michael's, and afterwards she walked in the orchard among the prune trees and thought of the winter apples that would come off them in October if the frost held off in the blossom. She wrote once to Mr. Halliwell in the 2nd week of May, and asked him to invest a further sum for her out of the deposit at the London and Midland Bank in the same 3 per cents, and he did so, and she wrote to him again in the 4th week of May, and asked him to draw up a small paper of settlement upon herself of the cottage and orchard in her own name, which he also did. And by the end of that month, Miss Laura Turner, spinster, of the cottage at the top of the lane at Bramble End, was the sole freehold owner of a cottage of 3 rooms, and an attic and an orchard of half an acre, and stood in the books of the Bank of England for £1,000 in the 3 per cent consolidated annuities, yielding her £30 a year in dividends without her lifting her hand. She did not tell her sisters. She did not need to. Margaret and Adelaide came up the hill together in the last week of May on a Sunday afternoon, in their good dresses and their best bonnets, and stood in the small parlor and looked about them at the whitewashed walls and the mended chimney and the row of blue-rimmed plates, and the 4 little slates set against the wall for the Monday lesson. And Margaret said that Laura had made the place very tidy, and asked whether Laura was keeping her accounts properly. And Laura said she was, and offered them tea in the blue-rimmed cups. And Margaret said they would not stop. And Adelaide looked at the folded grey wool shawl over the back of the rush chair and did not speak. And they went down the hill again, the way they had come. Laura stood in the doorway of the cottage in the late afternoon light and watched them go. And she put her hand up to her throat and felt the small silver thimble on its black silk cord warm against her collarbone. And she thought of Miss Frances Marlowe's prayer, that the child who found the trunk would use it well and quietly, and she went in and set the kettle on for her own tea. That summer the orchard came into leaf, and the blossom held past the last frost, and by the end of June, the 9 trees at the back of the cottage were set with small green fruit no bigger than a shilling. Laura kept the grass down between the rows with a scythe borrowed from Mr. Bunce, and she staked the broad beans in the bed by the scullery, with hazel twigs cut from the stand below the pound, and she took the 4 girls out into the orchard on the last afternoon of every week, and let them read aloud under the damson tree, while she mended a stocking or hemmed a piece of calico for one of them who had none of her own. Old Mrs. Perry came up on Sunday afternoons with her blackthorn stick and sat in the rush chair by the parlor window, and told Laura things about her mother that Laura had never been told at home. That she had sung in the kitchen at Bramble End when she thought no one was listening. That she had kept a jar of dried lavender on the sill of the 2nd bedroom. That she had walked up this same hill in the last summer of her life to sit with Miss Frances Marlowe when Miss Marlowe was in a fever, and that the 2 women, who were no kin, had held each other's hands across the ticking cover of the bed upstairs. Laura listened, and she did not speak much, and she thought that a house was not the rooms in it, but the women who had passed through them, and that Margaret and Adelaide had counted the rooms and had not counted the women, and had therefore taken less than they thought. On a warm afternoon in the middle of July, when the lessons were done and the girls had gone down the hill in a chattering line, Laura sat at the deal table in the kitchen with the trunk open at her feet for the first time since March. She took out the child's cross-stitched sampler worked in 1798 by Frances Marlowe, aged 9, and she pinned it to the whitewashed wall above the deal table with 4 small tacks, bought of Mr. Halstead. She took out the christening gown of fine longcloth and laid it, folded, in the top drawer of the dresser beneath the blue-rimmed plates. She took out the folded grey wool shawl and put it over her own shoulders for a moment, and then folded it again and laid it on the seat of the rush chair by the window where Miss Frances Marlowe had died. She took Miss Wren's copy of Mrs. Rundle's Domestic Cookery in shabby green cloth from the shelf beside the range and opened the front cover and took out the folded square of paper that said, "For Laura, who will do very well, keep your head. H.W." And she laid it on the deal table beside the letter of Miss Frances Marlowe, signed the 30th day of September, 1858. She looked at the 2 papers side by side in the afternoon light. 2 women, neither of them her mother, both of them dead, both of them poor of family in the ordinary sense, both of them careful, both of them kind. One had taught her to hem a sheet and turn a collar and keep her head, and the other had left her, without ever seeing her face, 40 sovereigns in a leather bag, a cottage on freehold, an orchard of half an acre, and £1,000 in the 3% at the Bank of England. She took the small silver thimble on its black silk cord from her throat and set it on the deal table beside the 2 folded papers, and she thought that between them they were the whole of her inheritance, and that the sisters at the foot of the hill, who had between them the front parlor and the back parlor and the mahogany table and the pier glass and the 8-day clock in the hall, had inherited only wood and glass. By harvest, Bramble End had, without saying so aloud, given Laura her place. Mrs. Ashby stopped at the low front wall on her way down from the smithy to leave a jug of buttermilk. Tom Ashby came up on a Sunday to mend the hinge of the crooked green door for nothing. Mr. Redfern touched his hat when she passed on the lane and called her Miss Turner. Nell, the brindle bitch, spent 3 days of the week on the flags by Laura's range and only 2 at Mr. Bunce's. The 4 girls came in and out with their slates. The vicar drank her seed cake and asked after the accounts book kept in her clear round hand, and said Miss Marlowe would be pleased. Margaret and Adelaide, in their houses at Alcester and Redditch, spent through the summer what they had taken in March. Margaret sold the pier glass to pay a milliner's bill, and Adelaide's husband broke one of the Windsor chairs and pawned the pair of pewter spoons Miss Wren had once polished with brick dust on a Saturday morning, and neither of them came up the hill after May. Laura Turner was 18 and newly orphaned, and her sisters had taken the rooms and the furniture and the linen and the plate, and had left her only a battered trunk in the shuttered attic beneath the slates. She had climbed the ladder in her morning dress and turned the key, and inside the trunk she had found a gray wool shawl, a christening gown, a child's sampler, 3 packets of papers tied with red legal ribbon, 40 sovereigns in a small leather bag, and a letter from a woman she had never met. It was the poorest share, and it was the best share. It was the corner of the house no one had wanted, and it had held a cottage of her own, an orchard of half an acre, £30 a year in dividends from the Bank of England, 4 girls at her deal table 3 afternoons a week, a pew in St. Michael's, and a name in Bramble End that meant her and no one else. It was the trunk in the attic, and it was the best inheritance she ever had. If this story sat with you, do stay a moment and subscribe, and share it on with someone who has been given the smallest share of something and told to be grateful for it. And before you go, tell us in the comments, what has come to you in a plain wrapping that turned out, in the end, to be the richest thing you owned?